Hi everybody and welcome back to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. If you enjoy these podcasts and want to help us grow and expand our audience, there's a few simple ways you can help us. You can follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Facebook, search Fantasy Animation, and you should find us nice and easily. On Twitter, it's Fananim Research, Fananim Research. Give us a follow, retweet, give us a like. That would really help. You can also subscribe via iTunes, Apple Podcasts, I believe it's now called these days, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, all the various podcasting networks. We're on them all. Give us a subscribe, please, because that helps us go up in the rankings and make us more visible on those profiles. And if you're on Apple, give us a rating. That always helps as well. Otherwise, sit back and enjoy the show.
Oh, yeah.
There are despots and dictators, political manipulators.
Hello everybody and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So this is, I guess, in many ways uncharted territory for the Fantasy Animation Podcast for three reasons. The first reason is that this is the first podcast that we're doing sort of remotely. So Alex and I are in different parts of the UK recording this online, so hopefully you'll bear with us. The second reason is that we're doing a film today that was voted for by the Fantasy Animation sort of community, the network, with the hashtag FeelGoodFanAnim. So we'll reveal the title of that shortly, but it's the chance for us to sort of engage with a film that people have actually voted for and pitted against other films. And then thirdly, it's the first time we've got a returning guest on the podcast. So today we're going to be doing The Emperor's New Groove, a Disney animated feature film, and we're delighted to be joined by Astrid Goldsmith, who you'll remember from a podcast we've done previously, The Valley of Gwangi. As a reminder, Astrid is an award-winning stop-motion animator. And so, Astrid, thank you very much for joining us on the first virtual, remote Fantasy Animation Podcast.
It is a sheer delight, you guys, and I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, good. So, yeah, I mean, we're sort of through, and actually, I think you were the person that suggested the film. You were the person when we kind of put it to the vote. Alex and I put out a bunch of feelers online on social media, and you suggested or you proposed, or one of a couple of people I think that proposed The Emperor's New Groove. So this is obviously slightly different from The Valley of Gwangi, or maybe it's not. I don't know. But what was it? What is it about the film? Why was that your kind of feel-good fantasy animation example?
Well, I think it's obviously we'll get into this when we're talking about it, but it is it's got it's a comedy. It's like an out-and-out comedy, and it doesn't really take anything too seriously, and it's it's just something that you can watch over and over again. I actually wrote my dissertation on it. About 18 years ago.
Wow.
And and I think that I obviously watched it a lot then, and it's something that I can watch over and over again. I don't really get sick of it, and it's I just find it just delightful. And when you're asking for a film that makes you feel good, that's just the first one I think of.
Perfect. So actually, I'm in a sort of similar boat. I wrote, when I was an MA student, wrote a dissertation on kind of Disney of this period. On the flip side, Alex had not seen the film up until a couple of days ago, where we did a live sort of tweet along, and we were talking a little bit off air about. I was trying to get Alex's feelings on the film, and you said that it took you an hour to get into it. So, what did you think of the film? Can you understand why it was kind of proposed as a feel-good fan anim?
Yeah, I hadn't seen it until we watched it on Monday, and it took me about an hour to work out what on earth it was, and then which is an unfortunate for an hour and sort of 17-minute film with about 5 minutes of credits, which meant I only really spent 12 minutes watching a film I understood.
Yeah.
And I haven't written my dissertation on it, so I'm feeling that I'm the Luddite as always in the room, but I enjoyed it. I think once I worked out, as Astrid was saying, that the film sort of is gleefully uninterested in narrative significance, consequence, anything to do with sort of the sort of the standard rhetoric of what we talk about when we talk about what makes Disney films great, which is getting us immersed in the world, getting us immersed in the story. The virtue of this movie seems to be that it wants to disrupt all of that and keep us constantly with an arched eyebrow towards everything. And once I got that, I started really digging it, and I'd love to rewatch it again now. But it certainly was an oddity for me, having only experienced it for the first time.
But it's interesting because you said that it took you an hour to kind of figure out what it was, and then you've got, as Astrid said, it's this sort of out and out comedy. I guess what's interesting for me is that what it wasn't what it sort of used to be, and one of the big things around the film, certainly during its production, so this is it comes out in 2000, its production in the late 1990s. One of the things, or one of the biggest sort of stories around the film, is that it changed quite significantly from what it had originally been conceived of or intended as this sort of what it seems to be a sort of epic, something historically epic that maybe falls in line with some of other animated features of the late 1990s. So I'm thinking of like The Road to El Dorado or The Prince of Egypt. It seems to be very much, which were made by sort of different studios. It seems to be very much in that vein. That's how it was originally conceived. And actually, Astrid, you said that it has kind of previous titles or old titles. It wasn't always going to be The Emperor's New Groove. I remember you tweeting along and saying that it had this kind of other life.
Yeah, so it was originally The Kingdom of the Sun. And it was originally a Roger Allers film, who was one of the directors of The Lion King. And he was, because The Lion King was obviously a massive commercial success, he was given pretty much carte blanche to do what he wanted and to create what he wanted. And so, yeah, him and his production team went on a kind of massive research trip to Peru and really got immersed in the culture. And I think the original story of The Kingdom of the Sun was kind of a Prince and the Pauper tale with a lot of mysticism, and it was a drama, a romance, epic musical drama with lots of songs by Sting. I mean, nobody's mourning the loss of those, let's be honest. But it kind of all went sour. I think a lot of things happened in the late 90s. And particularly Pocahontas and Hunchback of Notre Dame just did not perform as well as they needed to at the box office. And so I think Disney were kind of scrabbling around trying to find, alternative solutions to their, what they conceived of as a problem for the studio, which was that, they needed to claw all their money back from really expensive productions. They sort of halfway through production, they scrapped, I think it was 4 years of work, and the director was forced to give up the project, and a new director was brought on, who took it in a completely different direction, and they just turned it into a comedy. And I think I read that it was the first Disney animated feature to have such an extensive overhaul since Pinocchio, which is obviously a long, long time before this one.
So at what point did the llamas come into the story? I think that's the crucial question to ask at this point.
No, I think there were always llamas in the story. So in the original story, there was the Emperor, and I think Pacha was 18, and the Emperor's body double, basically. So they switch places, and somehow the Emperor gets turned into a llama. So I think that was pretty much the only story element that was retained throughout the process.
Interesting. I mean, it feels like, I don't know, these sorts of narratives. You said, Astrid, that a lot of stuff was going on in the 90s, and it feels, yes, I agree with that. I think the 90s are actually an interesting period generally, and you have, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, you have Disney's shift, as you mentioned, between these big budget Broadway style musicals. Decade begins with Aladdin and Lion King, and then we have that slight shift to Pocahontas and Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is obviously something that we've previously covered. Then you have, in the latter part of the 90s, a broader industrial shift with regards to computer generated imagery, the rise of the computer animated film, Disney's relationship with Pixar, the sort of rise of DreamWorks animation, and I mentioned a couple of the films that I think sort of come to bear a little bit on the intended epic nature of the Kingdom of the Sun as it was. So DreamWorks' 1998 film Prince of Egypt, and then a couple of years later, DreamWorks' The Road to El Dorado, which comes out the same year as Emperor's New Groove. So you have these broader sort of industrial shifts. The rise, perhaps, or the re-emergence, I guess, of something that kind of closely resembles a classical Hollywood studio system, where you have sort of brand recognition. Then you go into the 2000s, and then it kind of explodes, really. But it seems like a lot of, and I don't know whether this, I know Alex is interested in sort of Disney history and the way that Disney sort of narrates its own history, and these sorts of myths that survive within the Disney, fantasies of Disney, I guess, if you like. But there's something interesting about narratives within Disney animation of films. I think the French have I'm trying to remember now my undergraduate film studies, like a film maudit, i.e. films, and I'm sorry to the French contingent listeners for that appalling pronunciation, but these films that have that sort of production history where they are wronged or they are cut up and edited in different ways, and it's not what the director originally intended, and then out of it comes this sort of film that people love and whatever, and hey, despite the production tribulations, look where we are now. I don't know whether that necessarily applies to this film. I do remember, again, conducting research around it, looking at the movie and remembering that it had this whole kind of thing, this whole other life, which is sort of crystallized in, I think I'm right in thinking that Sting's wife I was going to say Sting's wife at the time, he's still married to her, Trudy Styler, making this documentary that would become The Sweatbox, this sort of behind the scenes, Heart of Darkness style documentary that accompanied the production of what turned out to be quite a kind of convoluted and problematic film in the end.
Yeah, which Disney have buried since. So yeah, they I think one of Sting's stipulations when he signed on to do the songs for the project was that his wife would have full access to the team so she could do a documentary, and then I think they had a kind of 6-day release of the documentary, and then it just went back into the Disney vaults and has never seen the light of day, because I think it is a really revealing, I mean, you shared the YouTube link, which is actually a pirated link, but it's a really, really interesting look at the kind of behind the scenes of how, of the studio during that period, and also of how this film kind of came into being. And I think, all of that stuff has kind of fed into the mythology of the production of this film, because you can see quite clearly in the Sweatbox those interviews with the Disney animators, and they're all terrified to not be towing the line, but it's obviously this very turbulent production where everything's just getting thrown out each week. More and more things are just getting thrown out and replaced with all these outlandish elements, which I think if you've been going along a track as a filmmaker, making this kind of very beautiful, realistic, kind of Peruvian epic that, means a lot to everyone, and that kind of gets thrown out, and you're just making this kind of what is essentially quite a silly buddy comedy about a talking llama. I think that, that's kind of a big emotional shift, for anyone.
Is there a sense from the documentary, I haven't seen it because I'm the woefully underprepared one for this week's episode, but is there a sense from the documentary about any stylistic shift in that? Because it sounds like the production they had in mind before this thing kind of shifted gear 3-4 years down the line was very much larger budgeted, perhaps, the kind of epic animation that some of the earlier hits of the decade suggested towards, and then what we've got instead is a very stylistically different movie, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But is there a sense that was part of the right? We need to change not only what this thing is saying, but how it looks while it's saying it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think several animators either quit or were replaced because they didn't like the direction that the animation was going in, because they had thought that it was, that they were animating these kind of serious, complex, interesting characters, and then that got changed. So I know that I can't remember his name, but the animator who was in charge of Yzma, he quit because he went to work on Lilo and Stitch, I think, halfway through the production, because he couldn't take the direction that they were going in with her. But yeah, and I think obviously, I mean, everyone sort of thinks that Disney have unlimited, deep pockets, but I think that there was definitely a financial consideration. They had spent so much money in pre-production that was just wasted. Then they also had to close down the production for 6 months while they kind of retooled the story. And so when they kind of got back up again to do Emperor's New Groove, I think that there just wasn't the resources to do kind of, extensive, beautiful backdrops that were, that in that kind of highly detailed classic Disney style. So yeah, I think that certainly visually, stylistically, there were definitely cuts, and you can see that in the finished film.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, Alex mentioned at the start that there is this sort of abridged quality to it. I mean, it's tricky perhaps to not see that, or that you're always looking, when you know the production history of something like this, that you're always kind of reading that into the construction of the narrative, the development of the characters. I wonder whether the particular sort of tonal shifts in the film and the kind of cutaway, I think the cutaway gags, or the rapid pacing of it in lots and lots of ways that seems to anticipate kind of stuff like Family Guy or BoJack Horseman, or all these sorts of quite witty and quick and very economical narratives. It's very difficult not to see that within the broader sort of industrial context. Anything relating to character development or narrative that seems slightly different to the norm, you sort of instantly kind of read that into the wider context. But at the same time, the film, if you think about the Disney films that come after it, they are, I wouldn't say as equally as quote unquote experimental, but they have a similar thing, and they don't have the production history that this film does. So I wonder whether actually we sort of give too much credit to the fragment, and I don't know, but it seems to be that the films that come after it, so Atlantis, The Lost Empire, which borrowed many of the animators when the production shut down of Kingdom of the Sun, some of the animators moved across to Atlantis, The Lost Empire, which is this kind of like anime influenced retelling of Jules Verne. Then you have Lilo and Stitch, which again, from what I remember, is quite a different kind of movie. I do remember actually more than the film itself. I remember the teaser trailers for Lilo and Stitch, which had I think it's Stitch, because I can't remember, but Stitch is the little animal, isn't it? Yeah. Mm. Yes. Gets inserted into lots and lots of different classic Disney, or Renaissance era Disney, I should say, scenes, and that's part of the promotion, is that you have this sort of foreign force influencing the Renaissance period. And then after Lilo and Stitch, you get Treasure Planet. And I would argue that it's not really until 2003 and the release of Brother Bear that you get something kind of closely resembling a Disney style. And then you only have one more cell animated feature film, and then Disney are off making computer animated films. So I think this early 2000 period of Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet are four films that kind of come together that you could group together, and I'd argue that some of the I'd be very surprised if some of the tonal elements or the tonal shifts in Emperor's New Groove were not subsequently then adopted in later films, but that then don't have that sort of production history behind it, that weren't truncated, that didn't have these problems, but I would argue are as much or as experimental, I guess, and as creative as The Emperor's New Groove. But it seems like this movie sets in motion something with the Disney studio that's slightly different from the films that come before.
Yeah, sure. I hence why it took me an hour to sort of to get with it, and I think the way I ended up sort of finding a way to view it was by sort of thinking it as an anarchic comedy, as a film that kind of like what you were saying with Lilo and Stitch. And I remember that trailer, actually, now you mention it, that trailer where Stitch is sort of inserted back into old Disney sort of iconic scenes. And the way the film sort of tells its story, and the use of humor and the constant sort of arch references and fourth wall breakings and sort of postmodern-esque deconstructions of the sort of story building and the world building made me sort of feel like essentially what I'm watching here is a film a sort of a Disney film told by the Marx Brothers, almost like, you know, a film that is derailed by its own concept and derailed by its own style, and that derailment is the pleasure in it. It's almost like it's articulating a pleasure in its failure to take itself seriously. Almost like it's a parody of a Disney movie. And that's what I worked out about an hour in. I don't mean that therefore it's mocking Disney, but what I mean is that it's the rhetoric's different. The direction is deconstructionist rather than constructionist.
Yeah, I think it's definitely playing with our expectations of what a Disney movie is. And I would say that there are points where it could be read as mocking the Disney model and its kind of slavish adherence to the kind of narrative structure rules. I mean, I think even, I don't know if you noticed this, and I might be reading too much into it, but the very opening shot of the film is almost exactly the same as the opening shot of Tarzan. So where the camera's kind of going through the dense foliage of the jungle. And obviously Tarzan was the last, I mean, before Fantasia 2000 and Dinosaur, which are slightly different types of Disney film. Tarzan was like the last big, drawn animated feature from Disney in '99 before Emperor's New Groove. And I just wonder if it is that kind of like a comment on, you know, our expectations of classic Disney world building, and kind of world building through lavish, like, an atmospheric artwork to establish that world, and then it's kind of immediately undercut by the style of character animation in Emperor's New Groove and the kind of knowing voiceover narration.
Absolutely, I definitely, I'd not made the link to Tarzan, which is interesting because it did remind me that you get these movies in Disney history that are notable for particular reasons, i.e. that they make lots of money, that they are this kind of multimedia franchise, but also that they might present a moment where Disney have innovated. So with Tarzan, you have this deep canvas technology which was used to create this luscious sort of jungle scape, and then you get Fantasia, and then you get Dinosaur, which is one of its kind of first sustained. Dinosaur is a bit of a tricky one anyway within Disney's history, but the Emperor's New Groove just kind of has this. Yeah, it's just there. It didn't. I mean, it probably did within the confines of the Disney studio, but it's not something that crops up in moments of technological innovation. It always appears in Disney's history as this move where there was this shift towards a kind of exactly what you're saying, a more reflexive, postmodern, dare I say it, as we've mentioned, but this sort of reflexive rhetoric that, as you say, is signaled immediately from that shift between the opening sort of luscious. Setting, and then you get that voiceover, "I'm that llama," and then you get Tom Jones or a drawing of Tom Jones, if you like. And actually, the narrative voiceover is one of the most interesting bits because it seems to continually intercede or intrude onto the film, and then he can have a kind of conversation with his own voiceover. So I find that really interesting. So yeah, I think that definitely the opening narrative voice where he says, "Oh, I'm that llama," and you just have the shot of this sad, crying llama in the pouring rain. Okay, we're doing something different now. We are that sort of fixed hyper-realist Disney register that we sort of know. The film is throwing it off. It's throwing off Disney's aesthetic groove. There, I've said it.
But to trace elements of continuity as well. Essentially, it's also extending aspects of some of these earlier movies, and what I'm thinking of here is particularly, you know, if you think about the genie in Aladdin, or even like Timon and Pumbaa in The Lion King, these characters that are allowed to sort of comment on the story as it's progressing and make comments about Disney in the process. You know, you get the genie dressing up a Pinocchio, or, you know, doing gags about, pulling the screen up and saying, "Made you look," and all that kind of stuff. Or, Zazu singing "It's a Small World." They're there in these other movies. It's just that they're sort of much more periphery. And it feels like what they're doing here is cranking it up and letting those elements take center stage for this one production. And the results are this sort of, crazy... madcap ride.
Well, yeah, rather than being the domain of a comedic sidekick, like in all of those examples that you just mentioned, it's the main character who establishes very early on, both in the opening scene and the opening song, like almost total control as both the narrator and star over the narrative order and space and time of the film, and how he kind of switches effortlessly between different presents and pasts in terms of timeline, even within the opening song, he's doing that. Which is, kind of confusing. It must have been confusing for you, Alex. I feel for you.
Well, confusing in the sense that I sort of, it wasn't that I was completely, at odds with the film style. I was sort of going with it, but I was struggling to find a way. I was trying to find a way of meshing this all together, because it sort of does shift every 5-10 minutes. The question I was settling on is, how much of this am I supposed to take seriously? Because certainly in the first sort of 10-15 minutes, there's some relatively, there's some legwork to be done to try and establish some sort of narrative stakes. And I was trying to work out about the villain, and characteristically, I've forgotten every single character's name in this film.
Uzma.
Yuzma, is it?
Yuzma.
Yzma.
Okay. Yzma. Yzma's sort of, is she supposed to be maniacal? Are we supposed to, dislike her? I mean, yes, but, is she supposed to be held up on the same stage as a classic Disney villain or anything like that? And I sort of worked out eventually that the answer is no. Just like it's the answer. As Astrid just said, the sidekicks are running the show for the stage, and what I felt like it played like was as if this assemblage of comedic actors had retold a Disney story, and done it. Yeah, so the Marx Brothers took over a Disney movie for once, and that sort of, once I worked out that's what it was, and it was I tell you what scene it was. It was the restaurant scene that made me go, oh, okay, oh, right, I've got it.
Oh, it's just a collection of sketches strung together.
Yeah, but that's the pleasure. But it's what's funny about it is that it doesn't make sense. It's not that it doesn't make sense; it willfully doesn't make sense.
It does also have this, quite a strong narrative running through it in classic Disney style. That they don't ever really drop the kind of the Patcher storyline. It's not, that's kind of kept going with traditional kind of romantic music and and there are stakes there, even though they consistently undermine the stakes, for comedy effect.
I mean, I would be interested to sort of, I guess, think about whether or not the film is trying to, given what Alex said about the continuities that the film potentially has in terms of its humour with other Disney films, but then what it does is then sort of centralises those elements, and rather than keeps them at the margins through sidekicks, brings it back into the kind of central character. So you have that. Then you have this idea of how the film sets up the narrative stakes, i.e. it sets up Patcher's character, it sets up Kuzco as the emperor, then it also sets up the villain, who I also always think is in it more than she is, because there's a whole bit where she's just not there, and then that's where I think the restaurant scene is really good, because it brings all the main characters. I mean, we haven't even got onto Kronk yet, but we will. But that's a good sequence because it has everybody together. I mean, I just wonder whether the film tries to really press upon the audience this idea of, and there are references in the dialogue, certainly within the first 10 minutes, to patterns of behaviour, groove, obviously, generally, but this idea of sort of normality, that the film is sort of, right, okay, well, the production is clearly rushed, or it was disrupted. People know about this, so what we'll do is we'll just kind of fold that into the film, and we'll make it this quite expressive. I think the opening musical number with Tom Jones, which is something I never really thought I'd say in the context of a Disney feature film, but the opening number with Tom Jones really does sort of, it is very expressive. It reminds me a lot of almost there, from Princess and the Frog and Friend Like Me, and all these sorts of musical numbers that become quite abstract in terms of their kind of visual design, and the space and time is all off. So I think there's something interesting about the style of the film at the start that is quite bold in announcing its reflexivity to kind of qualify, or maybe, I don't know, to appease an audience that is going to be aware of the troubled production. You know, it's kind of folding the potential reception of the film into the film itself. And then it sort of settles down a little bit. It calms down. It sort of introduces. I think it calms down when it shifts the action to Pasha, who's voiced by John Goodman, and it sort of shifts to his family life. And I remember while we were watching the film, Alex made an insightful point about his wife being, the first openly pregnant woman in a Disney feature film.
Yeah, I'm going to make another insightful point. I'm good at them. That isn't it. If that's true, if that is true, listeners, let us know. I think it might be the first openly pregnant character in a Disney movie, but I can't believe it is true, given how many mothers there are in the back catalogue. But I wanted to sort of riff on what you're saying there, Chris, about fantasy. And I think I've worked out what I'm trying to say is that the rhetoric of fantasy in this movie is subversive rather than constructionalist, and that's different to almost every Disney movie I've seen. In fact, every Disney movie I've seen off the top of my head, where the moments of subversion take place in something like Aladdin, it's to help us enjoy and understand the world and play along with it and enjoy it, but the moments of imagination in Aladdin are in the world building, are in the sort of sense of being in the marketplace. You know, the use of animation and the use of sort of storytelling and narrative to make us feel like we can see the fire in the Cave of Wonders, and that's so sort of, you know, what Disney does. That's its whole animation factory is about getting us to feel the imaginative, rich potential of and believe despite ourselves in what we're seeing. But what this does is that the imagination of the film, the focus of the imagination, is how it can disrupt rather than how it can build. Yes, the plot's there, but the plot's really just there so that we can have these imaginative moments that alter it, change it, fold it into itself. And that's where you feel like you're watching a fantasy. It's not actually in the world building, it's in the world deconstruction.
But isn't that I suppose that the idea of the fantasy can be or could be traced back to the fact that this is very much from Kuzco's point of view, i.e. that the narrative voiceover immediately frames the events that we're about to watch as happening in the past. And so, I mean, I'm not going to start suggesting that the film is truncated and has that kind of reflexive tone, or even that it's edited in quite a frenetic manner because of the fact that we're supposed to be in the mind of Kuzco. But there is something quite interesting about setting up. Think about all the kind of Disney films that come before it that announce, Circle of Life, and you have these big bombastic ensemble musical numbers versus this film, which begins in quite a personal manner with that voiceover. And I just wonder whether, I don't know, there's something to be said about the fantasy of the fantasy of a llama's subjectivity, the discussion of whatever. But it seems like there's something interesting about fantasy in the way that you've described it, because the film seems to be a haphazard collection of events that align quite nicely with a protagonist who doesn't really know what's going on.
Although he does consistently, assert his authority on on his take of what's going on, like, because with his narration where he keeps popping up, even he keeps popping up to remind everyone whose film this is and whose point of view they should be considering, and the fact that he's even narrating a scene where he's not conscious where he's in the bag, in Kronk's bag. And so it's kind of like a magic trick that the film pulls, that you're being taken along on this ride by this kind of omnipotent narrator who knows everything, who sees everything, but who was also in the film. And I think that it's kind of, I don't know, it's like if you kind of pull it apart or question it too much, then it does all fall apart. And I think Alex has got an interesting point where it's that, that's the source of the fantasy, that it's the kind of this like destructive kind of pulling apart of the narrative and the story.
Well, the pulling apart though comes, in some cases quite quite conventionally, i.e. the narrative voiceover that is seems to occur in a different time and space. It seems to occur after the film has already taken place, and I quite like the idea that in some capacity he's a spectator. He is, and this is what I kind of mean about the film trying to anticipate something about the audience, that he's being immediately framed as both participant and spectator, and that's why his narrative voiceover, as you say, seems to intrude onto the film at moments where he could either he wasn't even there or he wasn't conscious, and these kinds of things. So he's already seen the film. But then there are other bits where he stops the film completely, and that's the bit that reminds me of Aladdin. Made You Look, with the genie, where he stops the film at the end of Aladdin, where the genie pulls up the film frame and you can see the sprocket holes on the side of the celluloid. In a similar vein, you get a similar kind of thing. You get him stopping the film when he's a llama, turning to the audience and drawing on the celluloid. So there's something, he's doing these reflexive gestures, which are very sort of deconstructive, or certainly very deconstructive in the way that animation scholars have understood these traditions of deconstruction that are making reference to the kind of labor and artistry that produced them. That deconstructive, or that reflexive deconstructive rhetoric, seems to be married in the idea of fantasy. It's the thing that connects animation and fantasy. Again, we should do a podcast on those two things. But that sort of reflexive treatment of the fact this is a feature film that is printed onto celluloid, that has characters and narrative jeopardy and all these sorts of things. That's something that's sort of slightly different. And Alex, you're right. A thing that was previously at the closing credits of a film 9 years ago is here front and center.
And I guess that, to speculate on why listeners chose this as our first feel-good fantasy animation, I think one of the things about it is that it's so gleefully trivial because of all these things. Like, it's so gleefully lacking in consequence. And none of these words are meant as a critique. That's the joy of it, is that none of this matters. None of the events matter. What matter is the jokes, and that it's funny. And I can totally see why, because of all that, it's a film to stick on again, and a film to sort of, enjoy being in its company, because that's sort of what it's going for.
Well, yeah, and I think after a decade of big, emotional, punchy kind of, films from the Disney studio that, can be seen in moments as being emotionally manipulative, I think it is just a relief and a joy to see something which, kind of constantly comments on and undermines the stakes and plays everything for laughs, so that you can just sit back and enjoy the journey of like the road movie.
Well, actually, that's an interesting point, because you mentioned earlier about the buddy movie, and that's really the relationship. Certainly, the relationship between Pacha and Kuzco is the sort of thing that centers the film. But you'll obviously have another buddy. You have two buddies sort of running simultaneously. So you have Yzma, but then you also have Kronk. So Kronk, the sort of breakout star, if you like, of the film, voiced by Patrick Warburton. Kronk would go on to get a feature length, ultimately direct to video, but no less valuable for it. Kronk's New Groove, or The Emperor's New Groove 2, Kronk's New Groove. But you have these two buddies, and the relationships between those two, I think, are really interesting and really, really nicely structure the film in terms of its pairing. And as I said, I think that restaurant scene that you've both mentioned is that kind of theatrical moment, or that Marx Brothers film just in the middle, that 7-minute cartoon that plays in the middle of the film, that brings all of those four characters together, that plays with kind of foreground and background space, on-screen and off-screen space, and does so by playing with sort of front of house and the kitchen spaces of a cafe or restaurant. But I suppose at the same time, I was going to, and I don't know the answer to this, I obviously have seen the film, but I was just wondering in terms of what the film's then actually about, because I'd hate to sort of reduce the film down to a series of skits that it is kind of trivial. Is there a narrative there? Or is the narrative simply that Kuzco wants to build his sort of utopian, dare I say, magic kingdom on top of Pacha's house and decides that he just wants to move it next door. Is that really all that the film is about, or is there something else going on?
Well, I just think that what it's about is not about the narrative. I mean, we are, guilty of being a bit too obsessed that a film has to tell a coherent. Well, it does tell a coherent story. It's perfectly coherent. It just doesn't really matter. It's not why we're digging what's happening. It's because of all these other things, and so it matters in the same sense that it matters that Fredonia chooses to invade other countries or not in Duck Soup. Yeah, it matters because it's the platform from which to disturb. So it doesn't matter in the sense that it's not why the film is enjoyable, but of course because it matters. It's just it's not, if the film doesn't have to be about what its narrative is about to be deep. It's a profoundly deep experience to watch a film that brings people joy, and that joy is complicated and nuanced, and I don't really have answers to what it means, but it's certainly rooted in this, release from, all this sort of meaningful consequence and a celebration of anarchy.
Yeah, I think nominally the film, what the Disney studio would want you to take away is that the film is about friendship and, learning to belong to a community and not being selfish and all those things. But I think it's interesting. We haven't really talked about Cuscotopia. It's interesting that you raised that, because I think that is that's something that again, from the film's production history, changed so much, because the way we read it now is that, in a sense, like, you're aligning theme parks with the antagonists, or like the antagonist forces. So you've got like Yzma's lab ride, and then Kuzco's desire to build a theme park for himself, or a massive pool with a slide for himself, and destroy the village. And then that doesn't happen at the end, because he learns to like have a summer house that's just among the villagers. And so you could read that as The Emperor's New Groove, like rejecting the Disney model of old. But actually, if you watch Sweatbox, you realise that we only have Sting to thank for that narrative thread, because up until really close to release, even the ending was that Kuzco chose a different hillside to build Cuscotopia on, and Sting wrote this long letter to the Disney studio saying that he would have to withdraw from the project if that was the ending of the film, because he had spent the last 20 years defending Indigenous people, and to have a film that kind of just made it totally fine for the Disney company to come in and destroy villages of Indigenous people to build their theme parks. He just couldn't align himself with that, and they all sat down and thought, oh, okay, yeah, maybe he has a point, so they changed the ending.
So he still builds it, but he just builds it on a neighbouring hillside. So the kind of complex, the entertainment complex, is still going to happen. It's just the producers are a little bit more savvy in this case. Kuzco, because he's learned, as you say, these values of friendship and so forth. It's still going to be built. It's just going to be built kind of next door. And actually, the film frames that decision as something that feeds into the values that you described. And actually, the way you were describing the film and the characters, actually, in many ways, the film does support the values of the quote unquote Disney formula. It just doesn't seem to make that, or those values, the primary concern of the film. I'd like to do a bit more research, perhaps, into Disney theme parks in the year 2000. I know that there was a kind of millennium celebration, or a kind of two year long millennium celebration, Walt Disney World Millennium Celebration, that ran from October 1999 to January 2001. So I'd love to do more about, given the film and what it's kind of saying about this, as you say, this Cuscotopia. Because you're right, it's strange that it's associated with his degree of megalomania at the time.
Yeah,
and his redemption comes through the fact that he identifies or that he obtains a friend in Patcher. I mean, his family is interesting anyway. Like as you say, like the fact that I think that's right. He kind of symbolizes that community, and you don't really get much of that community other than through his family.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the depiction of his wife is, I mean, I don't know, I kind of feel like, I mean, you can level this criticism at so many films, but, you know, there's two female characters in this film, basically, and one is a witch, and the other one is like a pregnant Madonna in the kitchen who just likes washing up. So
that's that then. That's the Disney Studio in a nutshell. Actually, on the note of the villain, then there's a couple of things that kind of came up as we were doing our live tweet along. I think we need another. I don't know whether we can call it tweet along. Is that a thing? Social media a thon. But anyway, our live watching of the film. There are a couple of things that we haven't really talked about. One was anthropomorphism, i.e., you know, the use of animals, which is something that has come up a lot, I think, in this podcast, and hopefully regular listeners will know my obsession with registers of anthropomorphism. So hopefully we can get to talk about that. But also the depiction of the villain as well, and this idea of her sort of how the film qualifies her grotesqueness. And I don't know whether, I mean, I know that when we were doing the tweet along, Alex mentioned her vilification. So I just wondered, in terms of the character construction of Uzma, how that works with villains that we know, you know, how in terms of her construction as a character, her body type, her representation, that kind of thing.
Well, I think her body type is very different to someone like, you know, Ursula in The Little Mermaid, but I think it's similar in that, you know, she's vilified for being an older woman with a strong sexual presence, and you know, there's like so many references to her age and kind of revulsion around her appearance. You know, they say, you know, oh, look at those wrinkles. What is holding that woman together? You know, this woman's scary beyond all reason. And there's a kind of snide comment about how young Kronk is, you know, he's in his late 20s, kind of suggesting that it's inappropriate for a woman of Yzma's age to be associating with a young man like Kronk. And I think, I don't know, I mean, I think in one way you could see that as like, it kind of encapsulates Disney's drive to find something like new and fresh, like something different from, you know, that breaks with the traditions of, because she says like that she served the emperor for many, many years. And I don't know, I think you could probably see that as some kind of comment on the like structures of the Disney studio, but I don't know, I just think like for me it's I love Yzma's character, and I think Eartha Kitt is an amazing voice artist, but I think she was in the Sweatbox, she definitely voices her disappointment at the direction that they took Yzma's character in after it got, you know, after they went off from Kingdom of the Sun into Emperor's New Groove, because I think she was a much more complex character before. And then she kind of turns into this joke villain, and she's still amazing and very funny, but I think it is, yeah, it's kind of, there's also some like a bit of a kind of shame around that.
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add to that. I mean, I think all of what I would support everything we've all said about her, and the only thing what struck me, perhaps it should have struck me years ago, was that, you know, her part of her grotesqueness is her sort of angular waif-like body, and the sort of film makes a lot about the angle, the contorted angles she's able to position herself in, and the sort of almost spectral-like body that's very sort of it's barely present. And it just made me have a broader sort of thought about villains, in that we often think, well, I certainly at least often think of villains as vilifying fatness, but actually in a way this is vilifying sort of the angular body, and actually that's got as much of a heritage in Disney lore as anything else. If you think of you know, characters like Jafar, I mean, my mind's escaped at the moment, but I've got lockdown fever. But that's an interesting thing about the body politics that I hadn't really thought. That actually soft characters are soft of heart, and angular characters are angular of heart, and there's something interesting about that.
And also her body, her body gets attacked twice in the film. Like she kind of gets, almost literally tarred and feathered twice in the film, like once in the swamp and once at Patch's house, and gets turned into a human pinata. So, I mean, I guess it's like, and then her punishment is getting turned into a kitten, which is the kind of polar opposite, a soft, tiny, cute, round kitten, which is obviously like the polar opposite of an angular witch.
Well, I think this idea of, what we're effectively talking about is kind of character design and Disney's tradition, and I suppose many studios in terms of animation, some of the design decisions that are made around certain kinds of villainous characters. So I think the link to Jafar is absolutely right. So to kind of Dr. Facilier from Princess and the Frog. I think what kind of networks all of these characters together is a sort of, I don't know, an ability or how we engage with unruly bodies in whatever form that kind of takes. So obviously Ursula from The Little Mermaid is not thin and angular and geometric in the same way, but she's equally as unruly, and part of that unruliness comes from her hybridity between a kind of sea creature and a human. And that same unruliness is not afforded to Ariel. She is similarly a character of kind of mixed genealogy, or she is human and non-human at the same time. But Ursula's manifestation of that kind of collision is framed as unruly. Equally, I think Jafar, the way that he's drawn, this sort of tall, angular, versus the character in the same film Aladdin, the Sultan, who is round and soft and squidgy and looks a little bit like Santa Claus. There are deliberate sort of decisions certainly deliberate decisions being made, I think, in terms of character design that speak to a broader sort of question about what we do and how we kind of manage these transgressive unruly bodies, and part of, I think, their villainy, certainly whether it's Ursula, whether it's Yzma, whether it's who's very kind of spidery and spider-like and that kind of thing, comes from their unruliness, that in some way it sort of speaks to a broader a broader question mark over what we then do with or how we can manage these sorts of unruly bodies that draw attention to questions of beauty or so forth. So I think she's very much in a long line of Disney villains. But as I said earlier, I always think that she's not in it enough, and I hadn't kind of made that connection to the Sweatbox documentary in terms of I wonder whether a lot of the film's rehashing and re-editing comes at a cost to that villainous character, and also Patcher as well. I'd love to know more. To create more jeopardy, to know a bit more about that indigenous community and that kind of thing, that then gives a bit of narrative weight to Kuzco's decision later on. But in terms of the character design, she's kind of terrific, really.
But the balancing act, by losing all that, what you get is probably the quality of the movie that's meant we're talking about it right now, which is that it replaces an immersion in narrative with this ability to not care. Yeah, because actually, does it really, does it matter? I'm sort of trying to voice the intended reaction. Yeah, do any of these characters actually matter? Probably not. But that's kind of why they're pleasurable to spend time with, because I'm always buckling against the temptation to read films like this very mimetically as some sort of representation, and that what the film is asking us to do, or it doesn't really matter what the film's asking us to do. What the film does is allow us to sort of place ourselves in the world, when a film like this so clearly is trying to set up a wall between all these characters and ourselves. There's a distance, a critical distance between viewer and spectator, between spectator and film that's intended here, and by jettisoning our concern with the villain, her motivation, the world she lives in, the fact that her identity doesn't seem to make much sense, the fact that we know nothing about her, all of these things may take away from our ability to see them as rich, fully rounded characters, and there's political problems with that. but they add to the effect the film's going for.
But is it also because we're always going to be distanced because of the opening, or that kind of link that Astrid made to Tarzan? You know, that it's always it looks like it's going to be a Disney film or whatever that means, and then isn't, and then we have these distancing strategies of the voiceover, and then when the film stock is stopped and he draws on the cell, you get these moments that are deconstructive, yes, but their purpose. Or, you know, if their application is deconstructive, their purpose is that they always keep the spectator at an arm's length, and actually maybe that's part of, as you say, it's part of the pleasure of the film, that we're always being maintained at a sort of critical distance. There's always a sort of reflexivity between us and the film, in a way that I don't think is present in other Disney films to that sort of level of intensification.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. So you need to talk about anthropomorphism, I suspect, at this point in the podcast, Chris.
I did. Well, yes. And in fact, it's your point. I mean, the film itself is a transformation narrative. So the film obviously starts with Kuzco or it doesn't. It starts with him as a llama. Then it reveals him as a human, a sort of arrogant young prince king, and then it becomes a transformation narrative where, and this is to quote Disney, it's a tale as old as time, you know, in terms of fairy tale narratives, transformation, metamorphosis, and therefore you then get a character who becomes, even though he looks like a llama, actually acts like a human. And then there are interesting moments, and that's maybe why the restaurant scene is so interesting, because he is dressed up to look like a human, and you have this weird kind of human turned into llama, dressed up as a human llama of a different gender, I think. Isn't he dressed as a woman?
Yeah.
So this sort of layering of performance, so maybe that's what it is. It's not critical distance or reflexivity, or it is those things. It's parody, it's mockery, it's screwball comedy, but it's also performance. There's so many different levels of performance kind of built into it. One, because we know Kuzco performs a lot anyway. We have the Tom Jones opening, and he's very much part of that. He is a performer. He lies in terms of his relationship to Patra at the start. You know, he lies about this so he can get him out of trouble, and then he sort of turns on him. But his whole thing is about masquerade and performance. And so this sort of turn to anthropomorphism allows the film to create these multiple levels of humanity. And I mean that in both the looks like a human, but also this idea of sympathy and authenticity and not benevolent. You know, he's many things, this character. But it was actually, Alex, something that you said online about, you know, that he reverts to certain humanity. You know, I can't remember exactly what you said, but it sort of, in the film, Kuzco reverts to his most animal when he is wounded.
Yeah, well, it's almost it's the 50 minutes into the story before the final battle climax bit, where the character is at his lowest, and sort of has this sort of moment of existential despair and wants to obliterate himself. And so his way of expressing that is to actually become a llama, is to sort of take off his human clothes and go find a pack of llamas and try to join in their way. There's a sort of moment where he starts to try and eat grass, right? It seems to be his intention at that moment is to become a llama and live his life as a sentient llama for the rest of his life. And I'm aware, and like the film, I'm now taking a distance back from the words I'm saying out loud, and encourage listeners to crib that little bit of thing and just release it out of context and see what readings people can interpret in it. But there is some odd thing about, like, you know, the film expressing a destruction of the self as an embracement of animal identity.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of which other films do this, but I feel like, you know, that kind of trope of, like, it takes him, you know, turning into a llama to become a real human. That, you know, that's sort of like, I feel like we've seen that thing a lot, right? It's not unexpected in Disney.
Who hasn't encountered the classic man becomes llama learns to be man story? It's, you know, a tale as old as time.
I mean, I can knock that out over breakfast. You know, before breakfast, I've done that.
Like Pinocchio, actually. I mean, I think that the transformation scene of Kuzco into a llama is really reminiscent of Pinocchio's transformation into a donkey, don't you think?
Sure, although I don't like people to mention that sequence because it terrifies me just to think about it, which is why we've not done it on the podcast yet. But yeah, but the problem with what I found interesting is that in that, the whole terror is that Pinocchio might cease to be and he'll become Donkey. Whilst I just found it interesting that the narrative stakes of this movie seem to be that Cusco makes a sort of active choice to sort of reject to recognise that he is no longer useful as a human and so could only be useful as Llama.
Well, this is the narrative of Brother Bear a few years later on. So this is Disney's film from 2003, which I mentioned earlier, that has a similar kind of transformation narrative. So Joaquin Phoenix plays, or is the voice of Kenai, a human who, after killing a bear, turns into a bear, or he's turned into a bear to teach him to sort of see the world through the eyes of the other, essentially, and to understand human relationships, brotherhood, all these sorts of things. But what the film does interestingly is that it refuses, unlike this film and also unlike Beauty and the Beast, it refuses to acknowledge the turn back. And Brother Bear is, I guess, an interesting film in that sense because Kenai is transformed back into a bear at the end. So he rejects humanity and goes to. So it's just, again, and this is why I think these movies at the start of the 2000s are interesting, because a lot of the stuff that the film Emperor's New Groove does maps onto other later Disney films. So maybe it's, the film is more influential than we perhaps give it credit for, but it maybe is the start of at least Disney thinking a little bit about I don't know. The film is interesting, or the Emperor's New Groove is I don't know, pleasurable because it invites questions or interrogates the very question of casting, what you do when you cast animals as lead characters, or it plays with the transformation narrative, and it acknowledges that. And to have the first line, "I'm that llama," immediately foregrounds the anthropomorphic register to the film that is being, again, not reflexively engaged with, but I certainly think there's an interrogation in the film or an acknowledgement of what it means. Look what Disney does when we cast animals as lead characters or humans as animals who dress up. There's something around that there's a collision between nature and culture, or animal and human, that is at least a little bit more interesting, perhaps, in this film.
But that moment also sets up the absurdity of the plot point, which is, at some point in this movie, I will become a llama, like in all those other Disney movies.
Yeah.
And, that's, and I guess what it's also playing with is our expectations in that, is it clear at that moment, I'd have to rewatch it, whether this is a talking llama that's speaking, or whether this is a man turned into a llama? Because it's perfectly feasible that those first 3 minutes is setting up a film just featuring an anthropomorphized llama. I mean, the opening of Ratatouille, right, has a voiceover by a rat.
He says, "This is me. This is me."
Sorry?
No, you're absolutely right. That's exactly how Ratatouille begins. It begins with a freeze frame, and Remy says, "This is me. I'm a rat."
Right.
And so it's a similar thing.
That isn't a rat in a human in a rat's body. That is a rat that is sentient and omniscient and able to give us a voiceover. And there's an ambiguity in the beginning of Emperor's New Groove, I think, remembering the scene rightly, about whether what we're about to watch is a film about a llama or a film about a man trapped as llama. So even in that moment, it's not only setting up the absurdity of this being a story about a llama, but it sets up the absurdity of Disney anthropomorphic convention.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that ambiguity, I've not really thought about it in that way. That ambiguity works kind of both ways. It could be pursued in two different directions. One as Disney's in the business of talking animals, but or it's taken in the route or the journey that it is, which is that kind of transformation narrative. I'm conscious of. I mean, I'm just wondering, are there any kind of final, before we perhaps ask for favourite little bits, favourite scenes? Is there anything in terms of our notes that we haven't covered? I guess the musical numbers aren't. I mean, is this a musical per se?
No.
So you have an opening.
I think if there's no "I Want" song, it's not a musical.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can't be an "I Want." Well, given that "I Want" songs normally come between 45 and 50 minutes into the runtime, if it was to do so in this film, that would be one of the closing songs, I think, because it's so short. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about the music.
I think we should all be very thankful that it's not the musical it was supposed to be.
Well, I don't. I mean, yes. One can.
I mean,
only
it
imagine.
depends how you feel about Sting, but I mean,
Well,
the songs that were trailed in the documentary, The Sweatbox, I feel like we've all escaped.
we've all dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I don't know. I think it's given what is it? Phil Collins did the music for Tarzan. It's very in lots of ways the film is postmodern, but then in lots of ways it's very much of its time if you locate it within a sort of late 90s, what the Disney studio was doing. And so, I'm sort of torn between it breaking all this new ground, but then also actually being in many ways business as usual in terms of how it was conceived, its influences. Ultimately, it's become something else, but I think you can certainly trace some of the qualities in the film, as I said, to the films that came kind of before and after. I mean, I really like the reflexivity. I think, the opening musical number again perhaps sets it up as a musical, and then you don't really have songs. Again, you have more sort of evocative. A soundtrack. You have instrumental music and things like that. It's never as bombastic in its music as it is in the opening sequence. But yeah, I really like the reflexive register of the film. Do we have any favourite bits, favourite moments? Obviously we've mentioned the restaurant, but I just wondered, any other thoughts?
I mean, Kronk doing his own theme music is the film's highlight for me.
Which I didn't. I read somewhere that it's like, was it like an ad lib or something, or that I mean, Kronk. Yeah, we could do it. We'll do a follow up podcast on just Kronk, but he's a really interesting, very knowing, silly. And I put this on Twitter, but Patrick Warburton's voice performance, he's got a very decent. He's Brian from Brian. He's Joe Swanson from Family Guy, but he's very he's got a very good. And also has done a lot of work voiceovering computer animated feature films. So I think he's kind of great as Kronk, really. Alex, I remember you saying that you'd like this film a lot more if David Spade wasn't in it, but
I mean, he's fine. I just don't like. I can remember watching him in so many naff 90s sitcoms playing like awful human beings that are supposed to be funny. So I can't help picture him when he says things. So that's not good. But I guess that's my baggage, not his. He's perfectly fine in it, I thought. I like Kronk a lot. We could do a podcast on Kronk. We haven't, but he's been here in spirit. I also really enjoy the subplot involving Kronk and the squirrel. Which is another sort of parody of anthropomorphic convention, where he suddenly discovers he can speak to the squirrel by just sort of squeaking at it, and they sort of become strange, sort of another buddy sort of combination going on. Kronk's interesting in that Kronk actually is quite an earnest character. He's not being witty and dry and subversive and knowing. He's none of those things. But he's hilarious as well.
Yeah, the shoulder angel sequences are genius.
Yes, I've forgotten about them. They're also very good.
I was going to mention
the map chase as well. Go on. Sorry.
I was just going to mention the map chase. Yeah, I think the map chase is it's interesting because it cites the way in which animation is often used in lots of feature films as a shorthand. I'm thinking of the Indiana Jones movies, the plane going from one place in the world to the other. That tangling of the world of the telling and the world of the told, suddenly the map that is usually used as a graphic becomes part of the world itself, which again perhaps stands as a sort of symbolic, if you like, of the film as a whole, that it constantly is sort of moving between spectatorial positions, and then at the end, isn't it right at the end, how did you get there before us? And then they look at the map and they're like, I don't know how it shouldn't be possible.
Yeah, and it's also just really like wacky races, so it's just really fun to be kind of like folding that familiar sort of pleasure into the film.
Well, and I suppose if you think about the cartoon I mentioned earlier, the restaurant scene as being that sort of 7-minute screwball comedy that occurs in the middle. This is like a Tom and Jerry chase, or actually more than likely very close to a kind of Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner cartoon, where it has a series, which again work in these sorts of cycles that are just a series of vignettes that are put together. And so it works on a similar basis, that you have these little. The film is obviously very episodic, but that little chase sequence, you're right, is a nice callback to a kind of wacky racist style. Kind of golden age Hollywood cartoon. Alex, I can't believe you haven't mentioned The Wizard of Oz.
Oh yeah, there's an obligatory Wizard of Oz reference in it, isn't there? There's a joke about lions and tigers and bears.
You guys should really have a jingle for that.
Every time that happens.
Every time you see that you spot the Wizard of Oz reference.
Okay. So listeners out there who have musical ability, we will accept MP3 files of jingles that we can play whenever the obligatory Wizard of Oz reference is uttered in a fantasy animation. But it is amazing that it does happen over and over and over again. Yeah, crazy.
I like that, a jingle. All right, well, we best go our separate ways. Watch Kronk's New Groove and then reconvene in a few weeks' time.
I have one final point.
Great.
Very short. Is that I think that Cusco's slogan "No touchy" is a very potent slogan for our times.
Love it. That's why you're on this podcast, Astrid. Things like that. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's difficult when we're engaging with sort of the times that we're in, and obviously recording these podcasts in a particular way because of particular kind of circumstances. But yes, that's a good. Maybe that could be we'll end on that as a reminder, everybody. In the words of Cusco, no touchy.
I'll do some admin, shall I?
Please do.
On that note. Okay, so the Feel Good Fantasy Animation Party continues. We'll do another one of these in the next episode. The way you can get involved in it is you can, for the next few days, well, forever, continue to give me your suggestions. So send them via Fantasy Animation, the various social media pages, just at us or hashtag feelgoodfananim, FANANIM, the same as all our tags. Every suggestion you make will go into the Fantasy Animation hat, and I will draw some more out for another insanely convoluted competition to find out who we will watch this time. There'll be knockout rounds, there'll be votes. It all got thrilling last time if you have nothing else to do. I think that should be the slogan. Thrilling if nothing else to do. So get your suggestions in. I've got a pretty brimming hat at the moment, but I'll happily take a few more. We will vote on them throughout the week, so keep an eye on Twitter. And then your favourite selection we will do on the podcast in 2 weeks' time.
Or you can, as Alex said, you can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. You can follow us on the brand spanking new Instagram, and give us your suggestions. We'd love to kind of talk about films that make you feel good, certainly in these kinds of challenging times. And of course, if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast and part of our roster of special guests to talk about your favourite feel good fan, and then you can drop us a line with suggestions too.
Astrid, do you have anything to plug at the moment? Can people watch some stuff to fill their long hours in social isolation?
Yes, you can watch Quarantine if you are in the UK. It's don't worry, it's not a searing take on our current situation. It's about Morris dancing badgers. But it's available for free on the BFI player, and there's a link to it either on my Twitter bio, which is my handle is @MockDuckStudios, or there's some more stuff and links and things on my website, which is mockduck.co.uk.
Terrific. I think that's been us for another week, Chris.
It certainly has. Thank you, Astrid, for joining us. Certainly, for taking up the mantle of being our first returning guest. Certainly, yeah. In these times, it's nice to be able to chat about a film with a I was going to say friendly face, but a friendly voice. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's an honour.
Alex, you've now put me in the position where I'm going to have to do the goodbyes. So I'll say goodbye to you. I will see you or hear you again when we record our next one. And yeah, please do keep the suggestions for future episodes. And if you'd like to become a guest, do keep them coming in because they're really good for us to also. They give us a viewing list of things to watch as well. So keep them coming in.
Yeah, thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you next time for the next Feel Good Fantasy Animation.
Bye.